all. This is your Professor Ian. This is a lecture on the Odyssey. So this is kind of more the background of the Odyssey. In another lecture, I'll cover some themes and things to think about when you're reading this book, or selections from the book anyways. So let's talk about the Odyssey. Let's just start by reviewing what the Odyssey is. Remember, there's 7 or 8 parts to this larger story, which people call the Trojan cycle, and it covers the whole Trojan War, right? So the Iliad is the second book in this series. The first book actually covers the backstory to the Trojan War, which we talked about when we talked about the Iliad. The whole reason for the war and everything is supposed to be covered in this first book. And remember, part of the reason nobody reads these other books is because they don't exist in full forms. They're, we only have remnants of these other books and these other parts of the saga. We have the Iliad and the Odyssey in full detail. And maybe that's, some people think that's because of the quality of the work. If Homer wrote both of these, which, scholars basically say is probably true. If Homer wrote both of the Iliad and the Odyssey, they stand above in terms of quality, and maybe that's why they were preserved over the centuries and the millennia. Whereas the other ones were written by other authors and maybe didn't have the kind of poetic weight that the Iliad and the Odyssey did. Regardless, they don't exist in full form, and that's why we don't. That's part of the reason why we don't read them as well. So the Iliad is the second part. It covers from the anger of Achilles to the burial of Hector, right? So it doesn't cover the beginning of the war. It doesn't cover the end of the war. So the beginning is in this first book, and then there's a couple books, 3 books that cover the rest of the war the rest of the Trojan War. And there's some fun stuff. There's Amazons, there's the Trojan horse, there's the death of Achilles, and all that is covered in these books. And then we get the returns is called, the Nostoi, which is, the returns of various heroes. So, Agamemnon, Menelaus, the rest of those heroes. And then we get the Odyssey, which is specifically the return of Odysseus. He gets his own book, his own entire epic poem about his return to his home Ithaca. Whereas the rest of the heroes, even the great kings Agamemnon and Menelaus, are all told in this other epic. So that's where we fall with Odysseus. And then there's one final one, Philogeny, which is about what happens after Odysseus has returned to Ithaca. So it's interesting that Odysseus plays such a large role in the end of this Trojan cycle. Something to think about as we're reading through. Why does Odysseus play such a large role? Kind of mirroring Achilles in the beginning, right? Achilles takes up a lot of the beginning books, right? And then he dies as Troy is defeated, and then we kind of shift to Odysseus towards the end. So it's an interesting move in the terms of larger themes of the cycle. So anyways, that's where we are. Some characters in the Odyssey. The main characters we're looking at are Odysseus. He's we met him in the Iliad. He's the wily speaker. He's also a great warrior, which doesn't really come through as much in the Iliad. But he is a great warrior. But he's more known for his intelligence and cunning. And he's the one who, of course, comes up with the stratagem of the Trojan horse at the end of the Trojan War. So he is known for his intelligence and strategy and wit more than anything else. And he's our hero for the Odyssey. He's trying to return home to Ithaca. His son, Telemachus, he's been at home all these years. And remember, the war took 10 years. The Trojan War took 10 years. And then Odysseus takes 10 years to return. So Telemachus is a young man. He was a baby when Odysseus left. So he's about 20 years old during the course of the Odyssey. So, he's been waiting for his father to return. I'll talk about the suitors a bit later, but they've been trying to preserve the kingdom so Odysseus can return and take his place back as the king of Ithaca. At the beginning of the Odyssey, we're going to see that Athena comes and visits him and, has him go and search for his father to help rid the home of the suitors who wish to wed his mother. So there's a group of eligible bachelors, which are referred to as the suitors. So these would be, princes and important, the sons of important rulers of cities in the area. and around Greece, and they've all come to Ithaca to try to marry Penelope. They want to marry Penelope, and of course, there's the famous thing that Penelope did is she said to them, "Okay, I'll make my decision after I finish weaving this thing I'm working on." And every night she would go and she would unwind some of the wool that she had been using to weave this garment, and so that she never finished weaving this thing, so she never had to make a decision. So she's kept these suitors at bay for about 10 years, and they're basically camped out in Ithaca at their palace, at Odysseus's palace, eating his food and using his servants and all that kind of stuff. So they're leeches on Odysseus's household, and they're waiting to try to marry Penelope. And she's trying to keep them at bay because she is faithful to Odysseus. Right? So even though most people, he's been gone for 20 years, so he's been lost at sea for 10 years. Nobody's heard from him, so they all want him to be dead. They all hope he's dead, but she has faith that he's not. And again, she fools the suitors from having to marry again. So those are our main characters. There are fewer characters in the Odyssey than the Iliad, or fewer main characters anyways. These are our main characters. There are some side characters, but the Iliad is chock full of warriors and this and that, whereas the Odyssey is much more about Odysseus and his family. So what the Odyssey is about, it deals with the adventures that Odysseus has to overcome as he tries to make his way home to Ithaca, where his wife and child are waiting for him. So this is more of an adventure tale traveling through the lands of ancient Greece. So after the war ends, he leaves Troy with 12 ships and about 720 men, right? Because remember, he's the king of Ithaca, which is an island in Greece. So he's a powerful ruler. He's not Agamemnon level power. He's not Menelaus level power. Ithaca is not a big deal because it's kind of a little bit out of the way. But he is definitely a ruler of men and a king. So he's got this fleet of ships and soldiers and men that he leaves with. But the Odyssey is much less about military opponents, as we saw in the Iliad, and much more about monsters and enchanting women. We're going to see a lot of enchanting women. There's a lot of monstrous women that are trying to keep him from his wife and family, which is very interesting from a psychological perspective. So here's a map. I posted this as well as a separate document if you want to take a look. And this is one person's version of the journey of Odysseus. And let me just say right away, this is just one person's imagining of this journey, right? So this would be Italy here. This is Greece. So this is Ithaca, right, where my mouse is. This is Ithaca. This is Troy. Sparta is down here, and Athens, of course. Athens and Sparta are down here, right? So you can see Ithaca is kind of out of the way of the main. This would be the main thoroughfare of Greece, right? Ithaca is a little bit out of the way. It's still, it's a big island comparatively to some of the other islands. So, it's no small potatoes, but it's also not the main cities of Greece, right? But you can also see a fair journey from Troy, especially if you're sailing the kinds of ships, of course, that the ancient Greeks were sailing, right? One bad storm and you'd be lost, right? There's a lot of treacherous waters here. But anyways, this is one person's version of his journey, right? So here we are in Troy, over to here, right? Gets blown off course, ends up at the island of the Lotus Eaters. This is Cyclops, Aeolus, right? Up to here with the cannibals. Right, up to here. Gets stuck with Circe. Then he has to go over here to visit the underworld. Has to come back to Circe and then makes his way through the sirens and Scylla and everything. The sirens are up here, I'm sorry, but these are a bunch of obstacles he has to get through. All of them are personified as female too. Scylla, the sirens. And he makes his way through that, ends up eventually on Calypso's island, right? From Calypso's island, he makes his way right to the Phaeacians, and then to Ithaca. Now, what I like about this map is it shows, one version of his journey with all the different stops. Another thing is that the line, see how the line gets thinner as we go through. That represents the number of men that are with him as he goes through, because you can see he continually loses men. The line gets thinner as he goes through his journey till it's this thin line. That's just him alone, right? By the end of it, it's just him. He's lost all his men. Spoiler alert. But he starts with his full fleet. He keeps losing them, right? Ooh, he lost a bunch there, lost a bunch, right? And eventually, it's just him alone. Now, when we open the book, the Odyssey, he's already here, right? You're going to see there's a very different order of storytelling in this book. We start with when we meet him in book 5. We don't even meet him until book 5. Odysseus is already in Calypso's island, and then he gets over to here, and then he tells all his story and goes back and tells all this stuff. So when we meet him, he's already been at Calypso's island. It's already 7 years, or 9 years, I should say. It's already been 9 years since he left Troy when we first meet him. And then he goes back and tells us the whole story. And then the last 10 books or so, he makes his way to Ithaca and regains his throne. Okay, so let's move on. So meanwhile in Ithaca, he's trying to make his way back. Telemachus and Penelope, again, they've been fighting off these suitors for years and years. Telemachus goes and tries to, he's trying to find out if his dad is actually alive. He finds news that he is indeed alive, and he returns and prepares for his return and try to help him regain his throne. So, just a little brief overview. I just went through that map, but a brief overview. Odysseus is stuck for 7 years on the enchanted island of Calypso. Right, they're stuck on that island. She's tricked him into forgetting time, although they're also romantically involved, so it's kind of a strange interlude for him, I suppose. And that's where we meet him again in book 5. Then he makes his way back to Ithaca. He stops and tells his whole story to some friendly people he meets. And then he reveals himself to Telemachus and a few servants. And they formulate a plan to get rid of the suitors and recapture the kingdom, which involves the contest of the bow, the stringing of the bow. So anyways, that's basically the story of Odysseus in a nutshell, of the Odyssey. Here's a breakdown, if you want it, in chronological order, right? So after the Trojan War, he has all these adventures. That takes about a year. The next year, he's dealing with Circe. Next year, he's traveling to the underworld. He faces the sirens and some other obstacles along the way. Then for 7 years, he's stuck with Calypso. Finally, she lets him leave, right? He goes on, he tells his story. And notice how this speeds up here, right, in the last bit. And, he spends a lot of time just wandering around, meeting people and overcoming obstacles. And then finally, once he is allowed to leave and get home, once the gods, and you'll see the gods intervene a bit, once the gods intervene and decide, okay, it's time for him to go home, things speed up a lot, and then there's the encounter in Ithaca. Okay, so that's the timeline. It can get a little confusing as you're reading the Odyssey because he's like telling his story in the past, and it's a little hard to keep track of the timeline. But you can refer to this if you wish. I've also included a list of the minor characters if you want to refer to these. I won't go through them all. But there's the suitors, loyal servants that are still in Ithaca, some of the monsters that he meets, Laertes, that's his father, Tereses, that's the prophet that helps Odysseus navigate the underworld. And we're going to meet him again when we get into Oedipus Rex. I'm sorry. My mind just went blank there for a second. Okay, so I'll just leave this. This is just a list of the monsters and the minor characters he meets. Again, the Odyssey is much more about Odysseus and his family compared to the Iliad, which has a cast of many warriors and sons of gods and this and that. So I would say, in that sense, the Odyssey is more streamlined. But I'll talk about that a bit more in my second lecture. Thank you, and have a good day.